It's a beautiful summer afternoon. With no real plans, you get in your car to see where the road takes you. You drive out of Halifax and head northwest on the Trans-Canada Highway. The windows are down, a warm breeze is blowing, and you're singing along to your favorite song. As you drive, your best friend is on their phone looking for a destination. They turn down the volume, look at you, and say one word: wine. It's a brilliant idea. After all, you're headed towards the lush Avon Valley. But it's still early, so you make a pit stop in the nearby town to do a bit of sightseeing before you have dinner among the vines. You take the exit from the highway, and your instincts guide you towards the river and what you assume is the historic downtown. On the way, you drive by beautiful historic homes and are drawn to a white church that looks like it's been plucked from a movie set. You park the car and get out to find it's an old museum that collects and preserves artifacts from one of Nova Scotia's oldest communities. While exploring, something behind plexiglass catches the eye. It's a hangman's noose, and the information card says that it was last used on Wednesday, August 1st, 1906. Just as you finish reading, a chair in the room begins to rock back and forth. You look up at your friend and lock eyes as fear spreads across your faces. As you're about to say something, you suddenly hear a strange voice whisper, "Harvey." I'm Nadine Bailey, and this is Haunted Canada. Join me as I share the case of the last man hanged in Windsor, Nova Scotia. This is the story of Headless Harvey. Acadians settled in the area around 1685 when it was called Pistu and established farming communities and built dikes. They became allies with the Mi'kmaq. As you may remember from previous episodes, during the 7 Years' War, the British and New England militant expelled as many as 10,000 Acadians by force. It became known as the Great Expulsion. Then, British allies, including New Englanders, resettled the land. By 1901, Windsor, Nova Scotia was a growing community with a thriving industrial sector focusing on textiles and gypsum, the main ingredient in drywall. The Midland Railway had been constructed, which connected Windsor to Truro, making it a central transportation hub. Gypsum was mined nearby in the Funday Gypsum Company and easily shipped to the United States. While Windsor had become an industrial center, it had already staked its place in Canadian history. For one thing, it is considered the birthplace of hockey. Many historians suggest that Canada's favorite game has been played there since the early 1800s. It also has a place in provincial legal history. In 1774, the Supreme Court of Nova Scotia established a circuit system, meaning its judges traveled to different communities throughout the province to hear cases, ensuring access to justice across the province. Windsor was among the first communities outside Halifax to host a Supreme Court sitting. A courthouse was built on the present-day site of Christ Church in 1804 and was followed by a succession of court buildings at the corner of King and Victoria Streets. The courthouse, erected in 1897, was an elegant 2-story brick building with a hipped roof and large domed windows. It burned in December 1946, and the current, far less ornate courthouse was built at the same corner in 1950. The building also housed the county jail and its 17 cells. However, before the elegant courthouse and adjacent jail burned down, one last hanging took place. On Wednesday, August 1st, 1906, George Stanley was executed for murder at the Windsor County Jail, and from that day on, the town was never the same. George Stanley was born in 1866 and grew up in Roscrea, Ireland. He attended St. Crunan's Boys' School in Bray. The school first opened as the Bray Male Parochial Schools for boys ages 6 to 13 on July 20, 1820, as cottages on the Seapoint Road. In 1880, an increase in pupils caused the school to move to new premises besides Holy Redeemer Church, which George Stanley attended. During his time there, Stanley became a thief. By the time he was 17 years old, he had served a 3-month jail term for stealing a watch chain. A year later, at 18, he served 6 months for stealing a coat, and 1 year after that, he was sentenced to another year for stealing another coat. For the next 22 years, he was constantly in and out of 5 jails across Ireland. When released from prison for the last time, Stanley traveled to England and then Liverpool, where he booked a 3rd-class ticket under a new name, John Kavanagh. Stanley was described as being short, at just 5 feet 3 inches. He had bushy eyebrows and hazel eyes, and wore his light brown hair often parted on the left. After a hard life in and out of jail, he had a long, weather-beaten face and a desire to hide his past. As he boarded the ship SS Siberia for Nova Scotia, Canada, he listed bookbinder as his occupation. Their journey across the Atlantic Ocean would take 2 weeks. Once he arrived, Stanley hoped for a new life and a fresh start. But first, he had to make the hard trip to the other side of the pond. As a 3rd-class passenger, he was relegated to the lower levels of the ship. He would sleep in a large room with many bunk beds, all cramped next to one another. He was assigned bunk 125A, which came with a straw mattress, and every morning, breakfast consisted of salty oatmeal and tea. In the evenings, sleep would prove difficult on account of the many souls snoring or being seasick in the unventilated room. The conditions were not glamorous, and as soon as he stepped aboard, he reverted to his old ways. At the first chance he had, he stole a Russian man's coat, took the valuables, and hid it. Stanley very quickly changed his name again, from John Kavanagh to John Ryan. He told his bunkmates he was a tailor with a wealthy New York uncle who would wire him money. Tom Forsey befriended him and believed his lies. He was conned into offering Stanley a place to stay. Upon arriving, Tom Forsey took Stanley to the family's boarding house on Smith Street in downtown Halifax. Jessie Forsey welcomed them, but she had an odd feeling about the man who was introduced to her as John Ryan. She would be proven right. Almost as soon as John Ryan checked in, other tenants began complaining of items going missing. Believing he had stolen them, Forsey kicked him out, and Stanley began racking up unpaid hotel bills across the city. Local police were notified, and a warrant was issued for John Ryan's arrest. Hoping to escape capture, George Stanley hopped on a train heading west. He rode 25 miles away from Halifax and eventually made his way to Ellershouse, Nova Scotia, on January 26, 1906. He didn't know anybody in the small town, and as he searched for a place to stay, he reverted to using his birth name, George Stanley, again. This time, however, he claimed to be an agent for the Western Union Telephone Company as he knocked on boarding houses. Eventually, he was told about Freeman Harvey, an older man who might be interested in selling his farm. Locals shared that the farmer was struggling with the property, he was hard of hearing and lived alone because his wife often worked out of town. Freeman Harvey was an active and beloved member of the community who was responsible for collecting the school tax money. On Tuesday, January 30th, 1906, George Stanley made his way up Montague Hill and approached Freeman Harvey's farm on Dawson's Road. The large 2-story farmhouse was painted white and had an orchard in the back with a few farming fields. It also had a barn with cows, 2 oxen, chickens, and pigs. With that much property, it was easy to see why Freeman Harvey would find the upkeeping overwhelming. When Stanley knocked on Harvey's door, the farmer was wary of the stranger asking to buy his farm. In the book, Rooted in Deception, written by Lord Churchill Duke, she writes that he said, quote, "You don't look like you got enough money to buy it, though," end quote. Stanley lied in response to convince Harvey he had good intentions. Quote, "Not on me, but I'm coming into some money shortly from an uncle in America," end quote. Harvey hesitantly told George Stanley to return in 2 weeks. His wife Ida would be back in town by then. But in his attempts to shoo the stranger away, Freeman Harvey had committed his first fatal mistake. George Stanley now knew the elderly farmer was alone. Thinking on his feet, the career thief then asked the farmer if he could change a $5 bill. Harvey agreed and said, quote, "I've just collected the area school fees," end quote. That answer sealed Freeman Harvey's fate. On Friday, February 2nd, 1906, George Stanley announced to the owner of the boarding house he was staying in that he would not be returning that night. He told David Fisher he would be staying at Freeman Harvey's house to finalize the purchase of the farm. But before Stanley left the boarding house, he asked to borrow Fisher's knife and said, quote, "I have a little business to do and would like to have your knife," end quote. Fisher warned him, quote, "She's a bit dull, I'm afraid," end quote. George Stanley didn't seem to care. He took the knife and headed off towards Freeman Harvey's farm. The next day, on Saturday, February 3rd, 1906, George Stanley returned to David Fisher's boarding house and told whoever would listen that he had purchased the Harvey farm. He followed up the announcement by saying that the farmer had left town for a few days. Stanley claimed Harvey went to Halifax to see a lawyer to finalize details of sale. By Sunday, February 4th, people had become suspicious, and over the weekend, several residents decided to visit the Harvey farm. When they arrived, they claimed that they were there to help Stanley clean and rearrange things. As the day progressed, Stanley began to act strangely. He said no one was to go down to the basement, and that he would be the only person allowed to fetch potatoes for meals, as many would be staying for supper. To ensure everyone would follow his instructions, he nailed the basement door shut, then took a chain and wrapped it around the doorknob and fastened it to the wall. He then secured it with a padlock and placed the key in his pocket. Suspicions grew, and the next day, on Monday, February 5th, 1906, 2 neighbors went to investigate the cellar. They entered the home and with an axe broke the padlock and pried open the door. They lit a tin kerosene lamp and slowly descended into the dark and damp basement. They checked every nook and cranny. In one corner, they found canning supplies and pieces of wood on the floor. On the opposite wall, they found apples and potatoes that had been harvested during the previous fall, all piled into buckets. As the 2 neighbors began to sort through the potatoes, they found a horrific sight. First a hand, then a foot. The smell they had assumed was dampness grew more powerful as they dug, and soon they uncovered a decomposing body hidden beneath the pile of potatoes. They feared the worst, but kept on with their search. Then their worst fears came true when they turned over an apple bucket. Staring back at them was the decapitated head of their friend, Freeman Harvey. The men ran out of the farm to telegraph the local physician and coroner, Dr. Reed. In the meantime, Stanley arrived to see that his crime had been discovered. He ran from the farmhouse into the woods. By 2 p.m. that afternoon, the town had assembled a jury of 12 citizens, and upon Dr. Reed's arrival at the farm, he asked to access the basement to determine if a crime had been committed. Sources say that one man, with the last name of McCarthy, snapped back and said, quote, "What do you mean if it has occurred? In case you have forgotten, there's a man in the basement without a head," end quote. Dr. Reed responded, quote, "It's not up to you who committed the crime, but merely if it has been committed," end quote. Local police were notified that Harvey had been murdered, and they began their search for Stanley. Not long after, George Stanley was arrested by Constable Chapman and Constable Singer. During the arrest, they told him that Freeman Harvey had been murdered. To which George Stanley said, quote, "It can't be that that old man had his head cut off," end quote. After apprehending Stanley, police discovered that he had gone by several different aliases, such as John Ryan and William Kavanaugh. And since documents back then were hard to verify, police were never certain of his real name. Only 9 days after Freeman Harvey's body had been discovered, an inquest was held on Monday, February 12, 1906, to determine if Stanley would be tried for murder. While imprisoned in Windsor, Stanley wrote to many influential people pleading his innocence and asking them to aid him in his case. His letters were intelligent and civilized, not exactly what one would expect from a killer. In these letters, he would often reference his Irish heritage. An excerpt from one of his many letters reads, quote, "I am an Irishman, friendless and alone in this strange land, accused of an awful crime of which I am not guilty, surrounded by a chain of circumstances well woven together by my enemies," end quote. His letters were never sent. After a lengthy inquest, it was determined that Stanley would be tried for murder. While in prison, Stanley was quiet and described as a model prisoner, all the while claiming his innocence. His trial began on a cold and rainy Tuesday, May 29, 1906. The courtroom was packed with people from the community, reporters, and Ida Harvey, Freeman Harvey's widow. She arrived wearing a long black dress, gloves, and a small veiled hat. The trial was presided over by Justice Townsend. Medford Christie was the Crown Prosecutor, and with him was the Attorney General, the Honorable Mr. Arthur Drysdale. Both men were tall, wearing dark suits, and had distinguished mustaches. The defense lawyer was Hadley Treeman. He was his firm's newest employee and was assisted by John O'Mullen. At 10 a.m., the judge entered the courtroom and instructed the 12 all-male jury from Hants County to review 170 pages of evidence. Then they would determine whether or not Stanley was guilty. By mid-afternoon, the jury had arrived at a decision. They found George Stanley guilty of murder. Justice Russell asked Stanley if he had anything to say. Stanley slowly stood up in the prisoner's box and said, quote, "Thank you, sir. I want to begin by pointing out to Your Honor that I have not been given a fair trial these past few days. In fact, I would like to argue that my trial and subsequent condemnation already occurred last Friday by the Halifax Herald. The press and all the people, including the officers of the law, were all prejudiced against me. Everyone who has come near me since I was confined in jail has been against me from the start. I am not guilty of this dreadful offense. I am innocent of this awful crime with which I am charged." End quote. Judge Russell then passed his sentence. Quote, "I declare you, George Stanley, be taken to the place of execution on the 1st day of August, 1906, and hang between the hours of 1 a.m. and high noon, and may the Lord have mercy on your soul." End quote. With a loud bang of the gavel, the court was adjourned. Days before George Stanley was to be executed, the gallows were being built just outside his cell. He heard every nail being driven into the wooden beams. On July 30th, Mr. Radcliffe, the hangman, arrived from Ottawa. Father McManus visited George Stanley's cell on Wednesday, August 1st, 1906, to administer his last communions. Shortly after, Dr. Judson, the jailhouse physician, arrived. It would be his job to pronounce the time of death. Sheriff O'Brien and Father Carroll walked towards Stanley's cell as the time for his final walk approached. Stanley shook both of their hands and thanked them for their kindness. He also handed Sheriff O'Brien a stack of nearly 50 letters and asked them to be delivered accordingly. And when asked if he had any final words, he said nothing. Sheriff O'Brien placed metal handcuffs around Stanley's wrist and led him out of the jail cell towards the gallows. As Stanley walked up the steps, he was greeted at the top of the platform by the hangman, who said, "Come with me," as he led him by the arm to the noose. Radcliffe placed leather straps around his legs and ankles to prevent kicking and flailing that would eventually happen. A black hood was placed over Stanley's head, and the noose was tightened around his neck, with a knot just below his left ear. As this happened, George Stanley, in a little voice, said a prayer. The darkness was only lit by a few lanterns, and Radcliffe could see glimpses of people peeking through the cracks in the wooden fence. They would probably have been waiting all day for this moment. A silence fell in the summer night air as Radcliffe pulled the lever and the trap door opened beneath Stanley's feet. Father Carroll said, quote, "May God have mercy on your soul," end quote, as George Stanley fell through the opening. With a crack, George Stanley was dead. While justice may have been served, many believe that Freeman Harvey, the man George Stanley so callously killed, is not at rest and has remained behind. After the town of Windsor's last hanging, Harvey's ghost let himself be known. Judge Charles Edgar DeWolf, who lived in the area, reported seeing the apparition of a headless man in his basement window. He knew that parts of Harvey's corpse had been found hidden underneath a pile of potatoes, and the judge was sure that he had seen Harvey's ghost. Then, other strange things began to happen to him. One afternoon, DeWolf was walking home when an empty barrel appeared out of nowhere and rolled along Water Street across the road from him. Then it changed directions, kept rolling along the sidewalk, and turned sharply onto his front lawn. The judge couldn't believe what he was seeing. It was as if invisible hands were pushing the barrel. When DeWolf approached it, he heard strange sounds. Low groans coming from the barrel, followed by a man's voice that said, "I am Freeman Harvey." Terrified, DeWolf ran into his home. From then on, whenever the judge ventured outside, he would encounter Harvey's ghost, and it happened more and more often. One day, he passed a few boys on the sidewalk when suddenly they went into a zombie-like trance. This also happened to some clerks when DeWolf went into shops. The people he saw this happen to would remain frozen, their eyes staring straight ahead, and would only come out of the trance when the judge spoke to them in a calm voice. These disturbing occurrences became more concerning when coins began falling from the sky and light bulbs smashed on the ground out of nowhere. Then he witnessed chairs rocking back and forth and strange voices calling out his name. Judge DeWolf didn't know what to do, so he wrote to an organization that investigated ghost and paranormal activity, believing that a mischievous ghost had possessed the entire town. He included signed statements from other people in the Windsor area who had experienced strange encounters as well. The organization sent a reporter and a magician, yes, a magician, to investigate. While the reporter believed that many of the incidents were made up and blamed it on people playing pranks on each other, he could never disprove the sighting of the headless man in the basement window. For 115 years, the small town of Windsor, Nova Scotia has lived with the legacy of a brutal murder, and many believe that Freeman Harvey roams among them to this day. So the next time you're in the area, join the Valley Ghost Walks or read Rooted in Deception, written by Laura Churchill Duke, to learn more about Freeman Harvey, who you now know as Headless Harvey. Thank you for joining me as we explored the ghost stories surrounding Windsor, Nova Scotia. The Edmonton Ghost Tours sponsors Haunted Canada. I will link it in the show notes. Haunted Canada is written and produced by me, Nadine Bailey, with senior producer Dila Velasquez. Production and sound design is by Rob Johnson, with help from Rosin Kufer. If you would like to support this podcast, please follow and share. We would also appreciate a like and a 5-star written review. Also, you can follow me on our different social media platforms, or if you have a ghost story, haunting, or true crime that you would like for us to cover on this podcast, please email me through the website hauntedcanada.com. Thank you from all of us at Haunted Canada and Curious Cast. Have a good night, everyone, and stay haunted.